The airport buzzed with quiet efficiency. A hum of polished floors, rolling suitcases, and muted voices. Naomi walked with purpose, her tailored blazer catching the light, her heels tapping softly against the marble. To an onlooker, she might have seemed like any other first-class passenger, poised, successful, accustomed to this space. But there was more to her presence here. A quiet triumph in every step she took. This flight wasn't just a journey, it was a celebration. After years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and relentless effort, Naomi had built a business from the ground up. She had faced challenges most could not imagine, not the least of which were the barriers that came with being a black woman navigating a world that often refused to see her as an equal. But today, none of that mattered. Today was a moment to breathe, to let herself feel the weight of her success. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, the attendant greeted her with a polite smile, one that faltered ever so slightly before resuming its practiced warmth. Naomi noticed it. She always noticed but said nothing. She handed over her boarding pass and ID. Her expression calm, unbothered. She had learned long ago that not every battle was worth fighting. "Have a pleasant flight," the attendant said, her tone overly formal. Naomi nodded, moving through security and into the lounge. She found a quiet corner, sipped her tea, and allowed herself a rare moment of relaxation. The world outside seemed distant, its noise muted by the thick glass walls. Yet even here, she felt it, the sideways glances, the slight hesitation in how people engaged with her. They were subtle, almost imperceptible if one didn't know to look. But Naomi had spent a lifetime reading the unspoken language of prejudice, the faint tightening of lips, the way someone clutched their belongings a little closer. It didn't bother her as it once might have. She had grown adept at ignoring it, at focusing on the horizon instead of the obstacles. Still, a part of her couldn't help but wonder how long she would have to carry the weight of these quiet battles, even in spaces she had earned her way into. When the time came to board, Naomi stepped onto the jet bridge. The air cooler here, tinged with the faint scent of jet fuel. The flight attendant at the cabin door offered a standard greeting, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Again, Naomi noticed. Again, she said nothing. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was serene, the muted colors and soft lighting designed to ease the senses. Naomi took her seat by the window, letting her fingers brush over the plush armrest. She exhaled slowly, sinking into the comfort she had worked so hard to attain. But tranquility, she knew, could be fragile. The whispers began almost as soon as she sat down. Across the aisle, a well-dressed couple exchanged glances, their conversation barely audible over the quiet hum of the plane's engines. Naomi couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable, disapproval, tinged with a sense of entitlement. "First class isn't what it used to be," the woman said, her voice carrying just enough to ensure Naomi could hear. Her companion chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Anyone can get in these days." Naomi turned her gaze to the window, her reflection staring back at her against the fading light of the terminal. She felt the weight of their judgment settle in the space around her. A heavy, familiar presence. It was nothing new. And yet, as she sat there, a quiet resolve took root. Naomi had endured worse than this, much worse. If the price of her success was enduring the discomfort of those who couldn't see past their own prejudices, then so be it. The plane began to taxi, the rumble of the engines growing louder. Naomi closed her eyes, tuning out the murmurs, the glances, the unspoken judgments. She focused instead on the horizon, the place where the sky met endless possibilities. It was her moment, and she would not let anyone take it from her. The first-class cabin had its own rhythm, one of quiet indulgence. The low murmur of voices, the faint clink of glasses, and the occasional rustle of newspapers created an atmosphere of composed luxury. Naomi sat still, her hands resting lightly on her lap, the soft hum of the engines providing a backdrop to her thoughts. Outside the window, the runway stretched endlessly, a reminder of the journey ahead. A flight attendant appeared in the aisle, his steps measured and professional. His name tag read Michael, and his uniform was pressed to perfection. Naomi noticed the small details: a neatly tied scarf, polished shoes, He carried himself with the practiced ease of someone who had done this job for years. His smile courteous but devoid of warmth. "Good evening," he said as he approached Naomi's row. His tone was neutral, but the slight pause in his greeting was enough to signal hesitation. Naomi responded with a polite nod. Saying nothing, she had learned, over time, that silence often spoke louder than words. Michael handed her a glass of water, setting it on her tray table with a quiet thud. The gesture was efficient, bordering on brusque. Moments later, he turned to the passenger across the aisle, his demeanor noticeably softer. "Champagne for you, sir," he said, his smile now full and genuine. He poured the sparkling liquid with care, his movements slower, more deliberate. Naomi observed this without reaction, her expression calm. The difference in his behavior wasn't glaring, but it was there a subtle shift that spoke volumes to anyone who knew how to read it. She wasn't offended. Not exactly. This was familiar territory, the kind of unspoken bias that threaded itself through the fabric of daily life. As Michael moved further down the aisle, Naomi took a sip of her water. It was lukewarm. She placed the glass back on the tray and returned her gaze to the window, watching as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. Across the cabin, snippets of conversation floated toward her. A woman's voice, low and conspiratorial, caught her attention. "It's not the same anymore," the woman said, her tone tinged with nostalgia. Her companion responded with a quiet chuckle. "No, it's not. Standards have changed." They weren't speaking to Naomi, but the intent was clear enough. She didn't turn to look, didn't acknowledge the words. Instead, she let her fingers trace the edge of her armrest, grounding herself in the texture of the present moment. The meal service began soon after, the faint aroma of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread filling the cabin. Michael returned, carrying a tray of food that he set in front of Naomi with the same clipped efficiency as before. Her plate was simple, functional, but lacking the finesse she had noticed on the trays delivered to other passengers. No carefully arranged garnishes, no delicate presentation. Naomi took a bite, her expression unchanging. As the meal progressed, the whispers grew softer, blending into the ambient hum of the cabin. Naomi felt their presence like a low current, steady and persistent. She didn't dwell on the discomfort. There was no use in picking at wounds that had barely begun to heal. Instead, she allowed herself a moment of reflection, her mind drifting to the life she had built through years of effort. She thought of the barriers she had broken, the expectations she had defied. Yet here she was, in a space she had earned, still navigating the quiet complexities of being seen as an outsider. Michael returned once more to clear her tray, his movements efficient but distant. Naomi offered a polite thank you, her voice steady. He nodded in acknowledgement, the exchange brief and devoid of connection. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling the transition to the quiet hours of the flight. Naomi reclined her seat, letting her eyes close. She focused on her breathing, each inhale and exhale a quiet act of defiance against the unease around her. For all its trappings of luxury, the cabin held an undercurrent of discomfort, an invisible line drawn between those who belonged and those who were merely tolerated. Naomi felt its weight but refused to carry it. As the plane soared into the night sky, she reminded herself of something she had learned long ago. The horizon was vast, and her journey was far from over. The flight settled into its rhythm, the soft hum of the engines now a steady companion. Naomi leaned her head against the window, gazing into the inky blackness of the sky. The cabin lights were dimmed, and most of the passengers had shifted into a quiet lull, some reading, others drifting into sleep. But Naomi could not relax. There was a tension in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the faint charge before a storm. She had felt it before, in boardrooms and social gatherings, in spaces where she was both present and questioned at the same time. Michael reappeared in the aisle, his polished shoes making faint, deliberate steps. Naomi noticed his approach, her body instinctively bracing for another interaction. His demeanor was as measured as ever, but there was a sharpness in his movements now, a certain deliberateness that hadn't been there before. He stopped beside her seat, holding something small in his hand. Naomi glanced at it, a pair of clippers, compact and silver, catching the faint glow of the cabin lights. "We have standards here," Michael said, his voice quiet but laced with an unmistakable edge. For a moment, Naomi couldn't process the words, the meaning of his statement, the object in his hand, and the stillness of the cabin around her collided in a surreal wave of disbelief. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached forward with an unsettling precision, the clippers buzzing to life with a mechanical hum. The silence in the cabin deepened, the quiet rustle of newspapers and muted whispers replaced by an almost palpable stillness. Naomi froze, her breath catching in her chest. "Don't," she said, her voice firmer now, carrying the weight of a warning. But Michael didn't stop. With a calculated motion, he moved closer, the clippers touching her hair. The first uneven braid fell onto her lap, and then another, sliding down to the pristine carpet below. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Though no one intervened, a few passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and unease. Across the aisle, the well-dressed woman who had whispered earlier now leaned toward her companion, her voice low but audible. "Well," she said, her tone cool, "that's one way to keep things in order." Her companion chuckled softly, shaking his head. Naomi's chest tightened, her hands gripping the edges of her armrest. She wanted to scream, to push Michael away, to demand anyone do something. But instead, she sat frozen, her mind racing with disbelief and anger. The clippers buzzed one last time before falling silent. Michael stepped back, his expression blank, as though what had just happened was no more significant than adjusting a seatbelt. Naomi reached up, her fingers brushing the uneven strands of her hair. The sensation sent a wave of humiliation washing over her. But she fought to keep her composure. The cabin remained still, the other passengers avoiding her gaze. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended not to have noticed at all. Naomi inhaled deeply, her breath shaky but steadying. She looked up at Michael, her gaze unwavering. "Are you done?" she asked, her voice calm, each word measured. Michael faltered, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the galley. Naomi sat back in her seat, her heart pounding. The clippers lay abandoned on the floor beside her, a cruel reminder of what had just happened. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, and began taking photos. The hair scattered on the floor, the clippers, the faces of the passengers who had laughed, their smirks now fading into discomfort. Each click of the camera was an act of quiet defiance, a reminder to herself that she would not let this moment define her. As she placed the phone back on the tray table, Naomi let her hands rest on her lap. The cabin had returned to its uneasy silence, the hum of the engines once again the dominant sound. But for Naomi, the quiet was not an ending. It was a beginning. A line had been crossed, and she knew she could not let it remain unnoticed. As the plane flew through the night, she made a promise to herself. This fight was far from over. The plane moved steadily through the night, its cabin cloaked in a silence that felt heavier than before. Naomi sat upright in her seat, her hands resting on the armrests, her mind as steady as the hum of the engines. She had always believed in the power of quiet strength. But tonight, that belief was being tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. The cabin crew had resumed their duties as though nothing had happened. Michael avoided her row entirely now, his presence confined to the far end of the aisle. The other passengers settled back into their routines, reading, watching movies, or leaning into whispered conversations. But Naomi knew better. The atmosphere was taut with the weight of what had unfolded, though no one dared to acknowledge it aloud. She picked up her phone again, scrolling through the photos she had taken moments after the incident. The images were stark and irrefutable, her hair scattered across the floor, the abandoned clippers gleaming under the cabin lights, and the expressions of those who had watched it all happen. It wasn't just evidence, it was a story, one she knew she would need to tell. Not for herself alone, but for anyone who had ever been humiliated, dismissed, or reduced to less than their humanity. A faint rustling drew Naomi's attention. Across the aisle, the well-dressed woman who had earlier made snide comments was shifting in her seat, her eyes darting toward Naomi before quickly looking away. Naomi met her gaze briefly, offering no reaction, her expression calm and unreadable. The woman cleared her throat, leaning slightly toward her companion. "You'd think people would know how to behave," she murmured, though her voice was barely audible over the hum of the engines. Naomi said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken in that moment. As the flight attendants dimmed the cabin lights further, signaling the approach of rest hours, Naomi reclined her seat slightly and closed her eyes. She wasn't seeking sleep, her mind was too restless for that. Instead, she allowed herself to breathe, each exhale a small act of defiance against the chaos of the evening. Her thoughts turned to the countless moments of quiet resilience she had carried throughout her life. This was not the first time she had faced the sharp edges of prejudice. She thought of the boardroom meetings where her ideas were dismissed until echoed by someone else. The networking events where her accomplishments were overshadowed by assumptions about who she was and where she came from. But this moment, on this flight, felt different. It was as if all those small slights had converged into one singular act, demanding a response that was no longer private but public. The plane jolted slightly as it encountered turbulence, and Naomi opened her eyes. A flight attendant, one she hadn't yet interacted with, approached her row, carrying a blanket. "Ma'am," the attendant said softly, her voice hesitant. "Would you like this?" Naomi looked up at her, studying her face. The offer was simple, and yet it carried an unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened. Naomi accepted the blanket with a nod, draping it over her lap. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. The attendant lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more, but then she stepped away. Naomi watched her retreat down the aisle, the blanket a small gesture that somehow felt significant. As the plane continued its journey, Naomi began to draft an email to her attorney. She wrote in concise, measured sentences, recounting the incident with as much clarity as she could muster. She attached the photos, her fingers steady on the screen, and reread her words before hitting send. She wasn't angry, not in the way people often imagined anger. Hers was a quiet, simmering resolve, a determination to ensure that what had happened would not be dismissed or ignored. The flight eventually settled into an uneasy calm, the passengers lulled by the steady rhythm of the engines. Naomi remained awake, her thoughts anchored in the reality of what lay ahead. She knew this was only the beginning. The fight would require more than words and photos. It would demand patience, persistence, and the unwavering belief that change was possible. As the first hints of dawn crept into the sky outside her window, Naomi allowed herself a small smile. The horizon, painted in soft hues of orange and pink, reminded her of the possibilities still ahead. She leaned back in her seat, her heart steady. Whatever came next, she was ready. The plane landed smoothly, the soft rumble of its wheels on the runway a gentle reminder that the journey, at least in the air, was coming to an end. Naomi gathered her belongings methodically, folding the airline-provided blanket and tucking it into the seat pocket. Her movements were deliberate, a stark contrast to the hurried rustling of passengers eager to disembark. Outside the window, the morning light painted the tarmac in muted hues of gold and gray. It was the kind of light that softened edges, made everything seem quieter, gentler, but for Naomi, it only sharpened the edges of what had transpired. As the cabin doors opened, a polite announcement encouraged first-class passengers to disembark first. Naomi rose from her seat, adjusting her blazer and smoothing her skirt. She felt the unevenness of her hair, her fingertips brushing over the blunt, jagged ends. A fleeting wave of humiliation threatened to rise, but she quelled it with a steadying breath. The aisle seemed longer than usual as she walked toward the exit. The other passengers avoided her gaze, their silence as heavy as their judgment had been hours earlier. Even the well-dressed couple across the aisle, who had so openly voiced their disdain, now sat with their eyes fixed firmly on their phones. Michael stood near the exit, his posture stiff, his expression carefully neutral. Naomi met his gaze briefly, her face unreadable. She said nothing as she passed him, her silence deliberate. It was not forgiveness, nor was it concession, it was a statement of its own. Stepping into the terminal, Naomi was greeted by the coolness of the air, a stark contrast to the cabin's stifling atmosphere. She paused for a moment, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. The world beyond the terminal windows felt vast, its expanse both intimidating and liberating. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a notification from her attorney acknowledging the email she had sent during the flight. "We'll take it from here," the message read, succinct and reassuring. Naomi's grip on her phone tightened, the words a small anchor in the tumult of her thoughts. She found a quiet corner of the terminal, away from the bustling crowds, and sat down. It wasn't exhaustion that made her pause, it was the need to process. To reflect. This wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice. But this moment felt different. It wasn't just about her anymore. Naomi opened her phone's gallery and scrolled through the photos again. The images were stark, each one a reminder of what she had endured. Her hair, her expression, the clippers on the floor, all pieces of a narrative she couldn't ignore. Yet the weight of the morning wasn't just in the evidence she held. It was in the silent complicity of the passengers. The way their discomfort had manifested as avoidance. It was in the fleeting looks from the crew, the hesitation in their voices. It was in the way people had chosen, time and again, to do nothing. This was the part that lingered most heavily. The act itself had been cruel, but the silence that followed had been a different kind of wound, a reminder of how deeply indifference could cut. Naomi leaned back in her seat, her thoughts circling the same question she had asked herself many times before. How do you change a world that refuses to see what's right in front of it? She didn't have an answer yet, but she knew she couldn't let this moment pass unchallenged. It wasn't just about holding Michael accountable, it was about confronting the systems and attitudes that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. As she rose from her seat, Naomi noticed a man watching her from a few rows away. He was older, perhaps in his 70s, with kind eyes and a posture that suggested hesitation. He approached slowly, his hands clasped in front of him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I saw what happened on the plane. I should have said something. I'm sorry I didn't." Naomi regarded him for a moment, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said simply. The man nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, before retreating into the crowd. Naomi watched him go, the brief interaction leaving a small but significant imprint. The terminal grew busier around her as the morning progressed. Naomi walked toward the exit, her pace unhurried, her mind resolute. The day ahead would be full of conversations, decisions, and perhaps even confrontations. But as she stepped into the crisp morning air, she felt something she hadn't expected: clarity. This fight wasn't just hers. And it wasn't just about this flight. It was about all the quiet injustices that often went unnoticed. The moments that shaped lives in ways others rarely saw. Naomi straightened her blazer and looked ahead. The horizon was vast, and she was ready to face it. Naomi sat at her desk in her home office, her phone resting beside a steaming cup of tea. The morning's events were still fresh in her mind, replaying in quiet, disjointed moments the hum of the clippers, the gasps, the stares. Yet as the day unfolded, the immediacy of those emotions gave way to something steadier, a clarity that guided her next steps. She had filed her formal complaint with the airline earlier in the afternoon. It was a precise, unemotional account of what had occurred, accompanied by the photos she had taken. The response came quickly, as she had anticipated: a carefully worded email expressing regret for her experience and promising an investigation. Naomi read the message twice, her lips pressing into a thin line. It was exactly what she expected: swift, polite, and devoid of substance. The apology felt transactional, a response crafted not to address the harm but to contain it. Setting her phone down, she turned to her laptop and began drafting a statement of her own. She knew that her story, if told with care, could hold a mirror to the quiet injustices so many experienced but rarely discussed. This wasn't just about the clippers, the flight, or Michael. It was about the culture that allowed such an act to unfold in silence. As she typed, her words were calm, measured. She avoided dramatics, focusing instead on the facts and their implications. Her goal was not to inflame but to illuminate, to show how these moments, small to some, could accumulate into something much larger. By the time she finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, its last rays casting long shadows across the room. Naomi leaned back in her chair, rereading her words. Satisfied, she clicked post, sharing her story on her social media accounts. The response was immediate. Comments and messages poured in, a flood of voices echoing her experience. Some offered support, sharing their own stories of being dismissed or diminished in subtle, insidious ways. Others expressed anger not just at what had happened to her, but at the broader systems that perpetuated such behavior. Yet there were other voices too. A few dismissed her account, questioning her motives or accusing her of overreacting. Naomi read these comments with the same calm detachment she had maintained on the flight. Their words stung, but they also underscored the very point she was trying to make. The refusal to acknowledge harm was as much a part of the problem as the harm itself. Among the messages was one from a young woman named Alicia. "I work for the airline." Alicia wrote, "I've seen things like this happen before, and I've always felt powerless to speak up. Thank you for saying something. Maybe this will finally change things." Naomi paused, rereading the message. It was a reminder of the complexity of the situation of the individuals within systems who, like Alicia, wanted to do better but felt constrained by the structures around them. That evening, Naomi received a call from her attorney. The airline had reached out, offering a formal apology and proposing a meeting to discuss how they could address her concerns. Naomi agreed, but with conditions. She wanted more than an apology, she wanted action. The meeting took place over video conference the next day. Naomi faced a panel of executives, their polished demeanors betraying the unease beneath. She spoke plainly, recounting the incident without embellishment, then outlined her demands: diversity training for staff, a passenger bill of rights, and a commitment to meaningful accountability for incidents like hers. The executives nodded, their expressions serious. They promised to review her proposals. Though Naomi could sense their hesitation, the careful balancing act between genuine action and protecting their bottom line. When the call ended, Naomi felt neither victory nor defeat. It was a start, she reminded herself, but far from the resolution she sought. In the days that followed, her story continued to gain traction. News outlets picked it up, framing it within the broader context of discrimination in elite spaces. Naomi's phone rang constantly: journalists, activists, strangers moved by her story. But amid the noise, Naomi stayed grounded. She kept her focus on what mattered, the quiet, persistent work of turning outrage into progress. She connected with organizations advocating for equity in travel, joining their efforts to push for systemic change. One afternoon, as Naomi sorted through yet another wave of messages, she came across one from an elderly man named Robert. "I'm 72 years old," he wrote. "I've flown first class for decades. I've seen people treated the way you were treated. And I've stayed silent. I thought it wasn't my place. I see now that silence is a choice and it's the wrong one. Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to do better." Naomi sat with his words for a long time. They were a quiet affirmation of what she had come to believe: that change didn't always come in dramatic waves. Sometimes, it started with a single ripple, a story, a conversation, a shift in perspective. As the sun set once more, Naomi stood by her window, watching the horizon fade into darkness. The fight ahead would be long, she knew, but she felt no fear. Each step forward, no matter how small, was a step towards something better. Naomi sat in the corner of a modest conference room, her laptop open before her. The room was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of papers or the click of a pen. Around a table sat a mix of faces: lawyers, community advocates, and a representative from the airline. Each person carried a distinct air of purpose, though the tension in the room was palpable. Naomi had been in meetings like this before. They followed a predictable rhythm: polite introductions, measured discussions, and, often, careful avoidance of accountability. But today, she hoped, might be different. She glanced at the airline's representative, a woman in her early 40s with a crisp blazer and a calm, professional demeanor. The representative's expression was composed, though her posture suggested she was bracing for confrontation. "We want to start by reiterating our deepest apologies for what occurred on that flight," the woman began, her voice even. "The behavior you experienced does not align with our company's values." Naomi listened, her face neutral. The words were familiar, almost rehearsed. And while she appreciated the gesture, they rang hollow without action. "Thank you," Naomi replied, her tone steady. "But I think we both understand that an apology isn't enough. If your company's values truly oppose discrimination, then systemic changes are needed to ensure this doesn't happen again." The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air. Naomi felt the weight of their attention. But she remained calm, grounded in her conviction. "I've outlined my proposals," she continued, gesturing to the documents in front of her. "Mandatory diversity training for all staff, clear policies to address discriminatory behavior, and a passenger bill of rights that prioritizes respect and dignity for everyone, regardless of race or background." The airline's representative nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We've reviewed your proposals," she said carefully. "There's merit in what you're suggesting. Implementing these changes would take time. But we're willing to work with you to explore what's feasible." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Feasible isn't enough," she said. "This isn't about convenience, it's about responsibility. Every day that these issues go unaddressed is another day someone else could experience what I did." Her words were calm, but their impact was undeniable. The tension in the room shifted, the air growing heavier as the weight of her statement settled over the group. The discussion continued for over an hour, a careful negotiation of commitments and timelines. Naomi remained steady throughout, her focus unwavering. By the time the meeting ended, she had secured initial agreements for several key initiatives, including an internal review of the airline's policies and the development of a training program for staff. It wasn't everything she had hoped for, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, Naomi channeled her energy into something larger. She reached out to advocacy groups, joining their efforts to address discrimination in the travel industry. Through these connections, she found herself at the forefront of a growing movement, one that sought not just to address individual incidents, but to challenge the systems that allowed them to happen. Naomi began speaking at events, sharing her story with quiet determination. Her tone was never angry or accusatory. Instead, she spoke with a calm clarity that invited listeners to reflect on their own experiences and assumptions. At one event, a woman approached her afterward, her voice trembling with emotion. "My husband and I have traveled extensively," she said. "We've seen things, heard things, but we never thought to say anything. Listening to you has made me realize how complicit we've been in our silence. I just wanted to say thank you." Naomi smiled, her expression warm but restrained. "It's never too late to make a difference," she said simply. The work was not without its challenges. There were days when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, when the resistance to change seemed insurmountable. But for every obstacle, there were moments of progress, small victories that reminded Naomi why she had chosen this path. One such moment came in the form of an email from the airline's representative. The message outlined the company's plans to implement her proposed policies, including a passenger bill of rights. Naomi read the email twice, her heart steady but full. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Naomi sat on her porch, a cup of tea warming her hands. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink, the kind of quiet beauty that invited reflection. She thought about the journey she had taken, not just the flight that had sparked it all, but the years of quiet resilience that had shaped her into the person she was. The world was far from perfect, but Naomi knew that change didn't come all at once. It came in moments, in conversations, in choices to stand up rather than remain silent. As she sipped her tea, Naomi allowed herself a rare moment of contentment. The fight was far from over, but for now, she was at peace with the steps she had taken. The horizon stretched endlessly before her, a reminder that there was always more work to be done. And Naomi was ready for it. The auditorium was modest but filled to capacity. Rows of neatly arranged chairs faced a small stage, where a lectern stood under the soft glow of the lights. Naomi stood behind it, her hands resting lightly on the edge, her expression calm. The murmurs of the audience settled into silence as she began to speak. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady, resonating with quiet strength. "Thank you for being here tonight. I want to share a story not just mine, but one that belongs to all of us in some way. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. The audience was diverse, spanning generations, backgrounds, and professions. Many were older, their faces lined with years of experience and, perhaps, regrets. When I boarded that flight, she continued, I thought I was stepping into a moment of celebration. It was meant to mark years of hard work, of persistence, of overcoming challenges. Instead, it became a different kind of milestone, a reminder of how far we still have to go. Her words were calm, deliberate, inviting reflection rather than outrage. She described the events of that day with precision, each detail painted in the same measured tones she had used with the airline executives. I could have let that moment pass, Naomi said, chalked it up as another instance of everyday prejudice and moved on. After all, isn't that what so many of us have been taught to do? To endure quietly, to pick our battles carefully, to let the world carry on as it always has. She let the silence linger for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the room. But what struck me most, she continued, wasn't just the act itself. It was the silence that followed. The way people turned away, pretended not to see, or justified what they had witnessed. That silence was a choice to let prejudice go unchallenged. To let it grow. Naomi's gaze moved over the crowd, her tone softening. I don't say this to blame anyone. I say it because I understand. I've made that choice myself in the past, telling myself it wasn't worth the effort or the risk. But that day, something shifted for me. I realized that every time we stay silent, we allow these moments to define not just us, but the world we leave behind. The audience was still, their attention unwavering. Naomi continued, sharing how she had turned her experience into action, her meetings with the airline, the policies she had helped implement, and the connections she had made with others who shared her vision for change. This isn't just about me, she said, it's about all of us. It's about the systems we've inherited and the ones we're responsible for shaping. And it starts with small choices, speaking up when it's easier to stay silent, listening when it's easier to dismiss, and believing that even the smallest act of courage can create ripples. Naomi reached for a glass of water on the lectern, taking a small sip before continuing. Her voice remained steady, her message clear. In the weeks and months since that flight, I've seen something extraordinary. I've seen people who once felt powerless find their voices. I've seen companies rethink their policies, not because they were forced to, but because they understood the need for change. And I've seen strangers come together to create something bigger than themselves, a movement built on the simple but profound idea that everyone deserves dignity and respect. She paused again, letting her words sink in. This work isn't easy, she said. It takes time, patience, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of something better. But I stand here today knowing that change is possible, not because I alone made it happen, but because so many others chose to join me in this fight. The room erupted into applause, though Naomi's expression remained composed. She wasn't one for grand gestures or dramatic endings. Instead, she stepped back from the lectern, allowing the moment to belong to the audience as much as it did to her. After the event, people approached her in small groups, their faces illuminated with a mix of gratitude and hope. An older man, his cane tapping lightly against the floor, leaned in to speak with her. You remind me of my granddaughter, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She's always telling me that it's never too late to make a difference. I think I finally understand what she means. Naomi smiled warmly, placing a hand on his arm. It's never too late, she said, and every small step matters. As the evening wound down, Naomi found herself alone on the stage, the room now quiet and empty. She looked out at the rows of chairs, imagining the conversations that would ripple out from this night. She thought of the flight that had brought her here, the indignities she had endured, and the silence she had broken. It wasn't just her story anymore, it was part of something larger. Something that stretched beyond the walls of this auditorium and into the lives of countless others. The world wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But as Naomi stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the stage lights, she felt a quiet certainty. The horizon was vast, and the path forward was clear. And she was ready to keep walking.